Hello there, and welcome back to English 3020. This week, we're returning to Imagism and Modernism, two movements that involved a lot of experimentation in poetic structure and form. Like chemists, the poets of Imagism and Modernism took the elements of poetry and combined it with their new ideas about what poetry should be in order to create an entirely new form of literature. So join me this week as we study the science of modernism and imagism. Ezra Pound looks remarkably similar to Dark Lord of the Sith wannabe Kylo Ren. Ezra Pound, the first of our 6 authors for this week, was born in 1885 and died in 1972. And from a really young age, as a youth in Pennsylvania, Pound had a good idea that he wanted to become a poet later in life. When he went to the University of Pennsylvania, he befriended William Carlos Williams and H.D. Hilda Doolittle. He earned an M.A. in 1906, studying multiple languages such as French, Italian, Old English, and Latin. And his plan was to become a college professor to support his writing career, but he lost that first teaching job within 6 months because his kind of dynamic and whimsical and eccentric poetic personality was not a good fit for the classroom. So he moved to London to kind of discover a new artistic movement and a new artistic environment that would suit him better. While there, he married Dorothy Shakespeare, but also became involved with an American woman named Olga Rudge, and existed in some kind of polygamous relationship with both of them. He worked for several literary magazines and assisted in the publication of a lot of the other authors we're reading this week, and also some of the poets we read in week 1. So he was kind of very influential in helping expand the American poetic scene and get these younger poets published. And as we know, Pound started off kind of being the main figurehead of Imagism, but he then moved on to a movement called Vorticism. And the big difference between those two is that Vorticism still focused on clear presentation of images, but had this added element of presenting some kind of energy or movement or some kind of dynamic element in the image. He also used free translation, because he had this knowledge of different languages, which means he would translate the main ideas, but not necessarily the form and structure of Chinese, Provençal, and Japanese works. Pound, though, considered the United States to be artistically inferior. So Pound later moved to Italy and ended up supporting Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy during World War II, as he became really disillusioned with the way society had come apart after World War I and thought fascism was kind of the answer to repair society and to make sure we never experienced the chaos of World War I again. He actually broadcasted anti-Jewish and anti-US programs during World War II and was arrested as a traitor when the Allied forces entered Italy. He was never tried because he got off on reason of insanity, and he spent 12 years in St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Washington, D.C. He was eventually released and allowed to go back to Italy, where he died 10 years later. Hilda Doolittle, who went by the pen name H.D. Imagiste, is our second author for this week, and she was born in 1886 and died in 1961. And her pen name was actually suggested by Ezra Pound, who she had a close friendship and romantic relationship with at one time. And Hilda Doolittle's poems are considered the first significant poems of the Imagist movement. So there had been some kind of Imagist poems before, but hers kind of are considered the most important, kind of the starting off point of that movement. She was the only girl in a family of 5 boys in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and her mother was an active member of the Moravian Church, which is a Protestant branch of Christianity, and scholars believe that this kind of contributed to Doolittle's interest in imagery, as the church that she participated in was full of rituals and symbols, which kind of, led into an interest in the idea of images and what they signified. She was engaged to Pound for a time, but then moved to England and married his friend and fellow imagist Richard Aldington. Their marriage, though, did not survive World War II when Aldington joined the army. And from 1918 to 1919, Doolittle experienced a plethora of misfortunes. One of her brothers and her father died, her marriage fell apart, her friendships with Pound and British author D.H. Lawrence came to an end, she almost died of the flu, and she had a daughter who Aldington refused to acknowledge as his own. So that period was really rough for Doolittle. But luckily for her, a woman named Winifred Ellerman, who was the daughter of a wealthy merchant in England, one of the richest men in England, saved Doolittle from financial ruin. Some scholars and historians suggest there may have been a romantic dimension to their relationship. She lived in Switzerland for a time, caring for her mother and daughter, but returned to England in World War II. And in her work, H.D. was very interested in women's literary voices. She also loved history and Greek myth and kind of the Greek writers. So she actually ended up writing an epic poem of the story of the Trojan War from Helen of Troy's point of view. And in addition to writing Imagist poems, H.D. also translated some poems from Greek poets or Greek writers. And her father was an astronomer, so the images in her work are very much influenced by that and the Mediterranean settings of many Greek stories. We read Marianne Moore in the first week, but we're returning to her this week as another example of a modernist poet. So Marianne Moore was born in 1887 and died in 1972. Many scholars compare Moore to the American poet Emily Dickinson, as both wrote from within the woman's place in the home. But unlike Dickinson, Moore did not shut herself off from the world and society and kind of become this eccentric recluse like Emily Dickinson is famous for becoming. Moore was a really key figure in the modernist movement, and many people respected and admired her work. She was born in Kirkwood, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis, and her father actually abandoned their family, so they had to move to Pennsylvania where her mother earned money as a teacher. She graduated from Bryn Mawr College in 1909, traveled to Europe, and then returned to teach at the U.S. Indian School for 4 years. She published in several modernist literary magazines, which really kind of allowed her entrance to that modernist artistic world. She and her mother joined their household with her brother and moved to Brooklyn, New York, where she became a fan of the Dodgers baseball team and had access to literary circles. She never married, and she was a poetic critic in addition to writing poetry. She was also the editor of a literary magazine for a time. And Moore admired prose, not seeing it as lesser than poetry. So in her view, both poetry and prose had something to offer to the world. And she was kind of famous for combining historical and scientific descriptions into her poetic works. And Moore's experimental technique really encompasses whole stanzas. Instead of structuring them by stress and meter, which is the typical way of structuring a poem, she really goes by syllable. She has these patterns that link the lines through unexpected rhyme. And kind of in terms of how the war affected Moore, it really kind of influenced the subject of her writings, especially as she struggled to figure out how to view and interpret the fighting that she was not experiencing firsthand. She was a Pulitzer Prize winner for her poetry, and her 1967 versions of her poems are her poetry in its final, perfected form. She did extensive editing, so her poems may not look the same between versions. One of the most famous poets of the modernist movement, T.S. Eliot, was born in 1888 and died in 1965. Eliot is most famous for his poem The Wasteland, which takes a very dark and bleak look at human civilization after World War I. Eliot is another American who journeyed to Europe to continue his writing career, but grew up in St. Louis to a family that was originally from New England. He studied at Harvard and Oxford, but the war delayed his completion of his doctoral degree, which is why he ended up going into the field of poetry rather than the academic world. And Eliot was very influenced by the symbolist poets, and symbolism really sought to convey the emotional states of people through the use of symbolic and figurative language. The idea behind this is that it would help readers to get into the minds of the subjects, but also show how a chaotic and incomprehensible reality actually is. He married Vivian Haig Wood in London in 1915. They separated but never officially divorced in 1932. She later died in a mental institution. Together, Eliot and Pound are kind of considered the champions of high modernism, which kind of has an even more elite status and sort of a less accessible status than just regular modernism. Pound later became a British citizen, so you often find him in anthologies of both American and British literature, as sort of both countries kind of claim him as their own. So similar to Ezra Pound, Eliot also became enamored with the fascists, thinking the world required that harsh hierarchical structure in order to kind of help it recover from the madness that was World War I. He began to express some anti-Jewish sentiments in his works, but never took it quite as far as Pound. Eliot was also influential in a school of literary criticism called New Criticism, which believes that the poem or text should be read in a vacuum, ignoring the social, political, biographical, and other external forces that may have shaped the piece of writing. It does emphasize the text and content of a poem, encouraging readers to kind of focus on what is actually on the page in front of them. So it does have some value as a literary theory, but it ignores other vital factors that should be taken into consideration when interpreting a poem. He later married his assistant Valerie Fletcher and returned to the U.S. frequently throughout his life. And the only poem we're reading from him, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is one of his earlier poems and kind of shows the influence of the symbolist ideology and is a lot less pessimistic than his later work. Our fifth author, Edna St. Vincent Millay, was born in 1892 and died in 1950. And as an author and a public figure, she really became a role model for the modern woman, one who had overcome the limitations of Victorian society and the rules of Victorian society, and had earned money for herself and lived an independent lifestyle where she was able to exercise her talents and use her energy. She and her three sisters were raised by a divorced single mother in Maine who worked as a nurse. She went to Vassar College, paid for by a person who admired her writing. While there, like many of the other poets this week, she studied languages, wrote music and plays, and dabbled in acting. She later moved to Greenwich Village in NYC, joining the literary and political rebellious thinkers who lived there. One of her plays written for the Provincetown Players Group, which she acted in and wrote for, won her a Pulitzer. She lived in Europe for 2 years and married Eugene Bosevian, and then moved to a farm in upstate New York with her husband. Unlike Pound and Eliot, she wrote anti-fascist material during the 1930s, and she actually wanted the United States to join World War II earlier on than they actually did. And Millay's poetry often discusses sexuality without shame, so there's kind of a frankness and a openness in her discussion of sort of physical relations between people. But despite this, many of her poems kind of focus on love falling apart or not succeeding in the end. Our last, but certainly not least poet is E. E. Cummings, who was born in 1894 and died in 1962. His full name is Edward Estelin Cummings, and he was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His father was a minister who also taught at Harvard. Cummings went to Harvard, graduated, and then eventually earned an MA in 1916. And Cummings started off writing more traditional poetry, but he then read Ezra Pound's writing and began to become more experimental with form and structure and content. So Cummings actually moved to Greenwich after a stint as an ambulance driver in France during World War I, and he continued to visit France, though, and his family's New Hampshire home after moving to Greenwich. In addition to being a poet, Cummings was also a painter. Through a combination of frugal spending, money from his art, both written and physical, and an allowance from his mother, Cummings really was able to make a living as an artist full-time. And Cummings' work really exhibits experimental forms like we expect from the modernist movement, and also a main theme we see in his work is that of the individual in opposition to society, and a celebration of nonconformity and going against the status quo. And unlike some of the other modernists, Cummings really wanted his art to be accessible and understandable, to a wide audience. The weird structure and capitalization rules of his poems, as well as his strange and often sometimes lack of use of punctuation, are all kind of focused on presenting an image of the poem on the page. So it's not only pleasant to read, but also pleasant or thought-provoking to look at. And as the Norton biography for him says, that to express his sense that life was always in process, Cummings wrote untitled poems without beginning and endings, consisting of fragmentary lines. So kind of all aspects of Cummings' poetry sort of ties into his sort of eccentric view on reality in general.